You remember those newsreels, don't you? The ones that showed up before the Saturday matinee at the Paramount? Soldiers rolling through European towns in tanks, our tanks, winning battles that the newspapers said were already lost. But what you probably don't remember is this. Those tanks didn't come from some distant military factory buried in the Rockies. They came from here, right here, from Warren, Michigan, just outside Detroit, from a place that didn't exist in 1939. And if you lived through it, if you were there in those early 1940s, you saw something that's almost impossible to imagine today. You watched a frozen, empty stretch of Michigan farmland transform into one of the greatest weapons-making facilities the world has ever known, in less time than it takes to build a modern house. But here's the thing few people know. The real story isn't about the tanks. It's about the workers. It's about American ingenuity in a moment when everything was on the line. And it's about how one company, Chrysler Corporation, bet everything on an idea so bold that generals thought it was madness. This is the story of the Detroit Tank Arsenal and how it armed America. Let's go back to 1940. The war in Europe was already more than a year old, but America was still at peace. Still making cars, still planning for the future like the world wasn't burning. But in Washington, the military planners knew better. They knew it was only a matter of time. By late 1939, military intelligence had made it clear, when America entered the war, the nation would need tanks, lots of them. But here's where the problem started. America didn't know how to make tanks. Not really. Not in the way modern warfare demanded. The Army's tank arsenal at Rock Island, Illinois was still building tanks the old way, the way weapons had been built for decades. Skilled craftsmen hand-fitting armor plates, machinists adjusting tolerances by eye and experience, custom machining parts because no two tanks came out quite the same. A single tank took months to build. Rock Island could produce maybe a few dozen a year, if they were lucky. For a modern war, that was nothing. That was defeat before you'd even begun. General Motors, Ford, and the other big automakers were being asked the same question. Can you build tanks? Can you build a lot of them, quickly? Most said no. The engineering was too complex. The machinery was too specialized. You couldn't run tanks through assembly lines like you ran cars. Tanks were weapons, precision instruments of war. That took time. That took craftsmen. But there was one man who didn't say no. His name was K.T. Keller, and he was president of Chrysler. Keller and William Knudsen were old colleagues. Knudsen had left General Motors to take a job in Washington, a $1-a-year man directing the nation's arms production for the Office of Production Management. Knudsen had seen what other companies were saying. He'd seen the doubts, the hesitation. So he called Keller, and in a conversation that lasted maybe an hour, Knudsen asked the question that mattered. What if we didn't build tanks the Army's way? What if we built them our way, the automobile way? Keller didn't hesitate. We don't build tanks the Army way, he told Knudsen. We build them our way. That single conversation changed everything. Keller went to his engineering team, his vice president of engineering, Frank Zeta, and his chief engineer, B. Hutchinson. They were stunned by what Keller was proposing. Go to Rock Island, see how the Army builds tanks, then come back and figure out how to do it on assembly lines, how to make tanks like we make Dodges and DeSoros, how to do it not in months, in weeks. The trio went to Rock Island, and what they saw horrified them. Hand-fitted armor plates, machinists using calipers in their own judgment, welded joints that were custom-adjusted for each individual tank. It wasn't manufacturing, it was blacksmithing. You can't scale this, Zeta said. You can't make 100 of these a year on an assembly line. No, Keller agreed, but we can redesign the entire production process. By August 1940, Chrysler had signed a contract with the War Department, produce 1,000 M3 medium tanks, and not just produce them, build the factory to produce them from the ground up. The location was already decided: 113-acre farm north of Detroit in what was then still mostly rural Warren, Michigan. The land was owned by Chrysler, part of a property they'd held for years. Ground was broken on September 12, 1940. The factory would be ready in 8 months. If you were there that winter, if you were one of the thousands of construction workers who showed up in September 1940, you never forgot it. Not the way it was done, not the speed, not the chaos that somehow impossibly worked. The architect was Albert Kahn, one of the nation's greatest industrial designers. Kahn had designed Fisher body plants, auto assembly lines, factories that were the marvels of the modern age. He understood flow. He understood how to move materials and workers and machines in choreographed patterns that made sense. But he'd never designed anything like this. The building had to be massive, 690,000 square feet, stretching 5 city blocks long and 2 blocks wide. It had to house assembly lines that would move tanks through 3 parallel production flows. It had to be strong enough to survive bombing. Kahn designed 3-foot-thick concrete walls in some sections, sloped roofs to deflect bomb blasts, and it had to be built fast. Kahn and Chrysler worked together to figure out the layout. Where would the machine shops go? The metal stamping, the welding bays, the assembly lines. Every detail had to be planned so that parts and components would flow into the main assembly line at precisely the right time, the way a river flows into the sea, with nothing wasted, nothing backing up, everything timed to the minute. By November 1940, the concrete was being poured. 51,000 tons of it, most of it poured in temperatures near zero. Contractors worked day and night. Men stood in freezing mud and poured foundations while their boots turned to blocks of ice. Trucks plowed through slush and mud, delivering materials. The site looked less like a construction project than a mining camp. Huge steam shovels moving earth like the land itself was being reborn. Multiple contractors worked simultaneously, racing each other. Burke Construction was the primary builder, but they brought in dozens of subcontractors. The competition between shifts became legendary. Who could lay more concrete? Who could erect more walls? Who could finish their section first? The workers, carpenters, electricians, welders, steelworkers, lived in the moment. Some camped near the site. Some drove in from Detroit and its suburbs. It was hard work, dangerous work, and they did it in the teeth of a Michigan winter that wouldn't relent. By January 1941, something remarkable happened. The building was big enough and complete enough that they brought in a steam-powered locomotive, just drove it into the plant. It became the boiler, the heating system that kept the massive factory warm while construction continued. Workers remember it, this impossible sight of a train engine inside an enormous building that was still being built around it. Even as construction crews were still finishing the walls and roof, something else was happening inside. Chrysler's engineers were installing machinery. Thousands of machine tools, some 8,000 of them in total, were being delivered by rail and installed even before the building was complete. These weren't just any machine tools. They were custom-designed, purpose-built equipment to manufacture tanks. Massive presses for shaping armor plate, welding fixtures that could hold pieces in place with precision to a fraction of an inch, grinding machines, boring mills, punch presses, hydraulic equipment that didn't exist before this project began. Behind locked doors, Army officers and Chrysler engineers worked side by side, designing the jigs and fixtures and dies that would turn raw steel into tank parts. 7 days a week, hours that meant nothing because the work had to be done. Owen Skelton, Chrysler's chief production engineer, led this effort. He'd spent his career figuring out how to make manufacturing faster, more efficient. He understood flow. He understood how to turn an assembly line into a choreograph of perfect motion. Skelton and his team made a revolutionary decision. The tanks would be welded, not riveted. The Army hated this idea. Welded armor? That was unproven. The heat from welding might weaken the steel, it might compromise protection, and welding required skilled operators. You couldn't just train anybody to weld. Skelton went to war with the Army over this. Chrysler built test welds. They subjected them to ballistic testing. They proved again and again that welded joints were stronger than riveted ones. They showed that with proper heat treatment, the stress could be eliminated. And most importantly, and this was the key to the whole thing, they demonstrated that semi-skilled workers could produce acceptable welds after just 2 weeks of training if the work was done on specially designed fixtures. The Army conceded. The M3 medium tank would be welded. By April 1941, the factory was still being completed. The roof still needed work in places, the grounds were a muddy mess, but components had been arriving from Chrysler's other facilities. Engines, transmissions, ammunition racks, all the parts that couldn't be made at the tank arsenal itself. And the workers had been trained. Thousands of them, recruited from the Detroit area, from nearby towns, from across Michigan. Men with no experience building tanks, learning the specialized tasks they'd perform on the assembly line. 2 weeks at a training station, practicing on dummy fixtures, learning exactly what their job would be, how many minutes they'd have, what the quality standards were. On April 24, 1941, the first M3 medium tank rolled out of the Detroit tank arsenal. It wasn't finished. The factory was still under construction, but that tank and the second tank that rolled out the same day were complete, fully armed, fully tested. And the nation celebrated. Radios broadcast the news across America. The Army held a ceremony. General E.B. Gregory, the Quartermaster General of the United States Army, was there to see it. A brass band played. Flags were raised. This was the moment. American industry, American ingenuity had done the impossible. They'd built a tank factory from scratch in 8 months and were already producing tanks while the factory was still being built. The War Department was amazed. The nation was amazed. What happened next would only intensify that amazement. In May 1941, the Detroit tank arsenal produced 1 tank every other day. By June, it was 1 tank per day. By July, 2 tanks per day. By September, 4 tanks per day. This wasn't just speed. This was impossible. It violated every assumption military planners had about weapons manufacturing. Tanks weren't supposed to come off assembly lines. Tanks were supposed to be carefully crafted, individually tested, lovingly inspected. But they were wrong, and Chrysler proved it. Here's how it worked, how it actually worked on the factory floor. The main assembly line was a 1/4 mile long, stretching the length of the enormous plant. Tanks moved from station to station, and every 55 minutes at peak production, a new tank moved to the next station. That meant every 55 minutes, a completed tank rolled off the end of the line. That's more than 26 tanks per day. That's production at a scale the world had never seen. Supporting that main line were feeder lines, dozens of them, bringing major components to the line at precise intervals. An engine on one line, transmissions on another, turrets on a third, tracks on a fourth. Everything had to arrive in sequence at exactly the right moment, or the main line would jam up. If the main line stopped for 5 minutes, production was behind for the day. Every person in the plant knew this. The coordination was military grade because it had to be. The machine shops in the northern section of the plant were producing drivetrain components, gears, transmission housings, engine components. The welding bays in the southern section of the plant were assembling the massive hull armor plates into the basic tank structure. Final assembly in the main line meant installation of turrets, weapon systems, engines, transmissions, fuel systems. everything that turned a shell of armor plate into a fighting machine. The workers became incredibly specialized. A man who installed transmission mounts on the line did nothing else. He'd spend 2 days practicing on training fixtures to make sure he could do the job perfectly. Then he spent his 8-hour shift installing transmission mounts, sometimes 40 or 50 times per shift. The same motion, the same skill, perfected through repetition. It was mind-numbing work, and it was genius. It was the automobile industry's greatest contribution to the war, the knowledge that you could take massive, complex machines and break their production down into simple, repeatable tasks that could be mastered in days, not years. A tank that once took hundreds of man-hours to build, hand-fitted, custom-machined, lovingly inspected by craftsmen, now took 150 man-hours of production. The reduction from 500 to 150 man-hours was a revolution. If you saw the plant during those war years, you would have noticed something remarkable. Women. Thousands of them. In 1940, there were almost no women working in tank manufacturing. It was considered men's work, the heavy machinery, the welding, the complex mechanical assembly. But by 1943, women made up a significant portion of the workforce at the Detroit Tank Arsenal. Teachers had left their classrooms, waitresses had left diners, housewives had left their homes, and they'd come to Warren, Michigan to build tanks. They did work that had been considered impossible for women to do. They learned to weld, operating equipment that required strength and precision. They worked as inspectors, machinists, assembly line workers. They became skilled at tasks that before the war only men were thought capable of doing. The nation celebrated them, the Riveters, and they deserved to be celebrated. Across Detroit, the female workforce grew from 182,000 in 1940 to nearly 400,000 by 1944. These women were the backbone of the war production effort. Without them, America couldn't have won. And they made decent wages, 95 cents to $1.60 per hour, real money. They could support themselves, their families. They were doing essential work for the nation's defense. The plant had facilities for them, washrooms, cafeterias, childcare assistants. Nothing perfect, but an acknowledgement that the arsenal was now a mixed workforce, and that these women were as essential to winning the war as the men who came home on leave. By March 1942, just a few months after production began, the Detroit Tank Arsenal was producing 12 tanks per day, still less than a year into full production. By July 1942, 18 tanks per day rolled off the main assembly line. By December 1942, in a single month, Chrysler built 896 M4 Sherman tanks at the Detroit Arsenal. That's more tanks than all of Germany's factories combined produced in the same month. During that 1 month, December 1942, Chrysler proved something that changed warfare forever. American production could overwhelm any enemy, not through more clever weapons, but through volume, abundance, the ability to replace losses, to equip new divisions, to maintain supply lines across the Atlantic and Pacific. General George Patton, Jr., the general the M47 tank would later be named after, understood this better than almost anyone. He believed in speed, in movement, in keeping the enemy off balance, and Patton knew that he could only do that if he had a constant flow of new tanks to replace ones that were destroyed. The Sherman tank, produced in such massive numbers at the Detroit Arsenal, became the backbone of his operations. Patton once said he never wanted to go into battle with yesterday's tanks. With the Detroit Arsenal producing the Shermans, he could afford that luxury. He could push forward knowing that fresh equipment would keep coming. By the end of World War II, the Detroit Tank Arsenal had produced 3,352 M3 medium tanks, 53% of all M3 production, 17,947 M4 Sherman tanks in various configurations, 36% of all M4 production. 473 M26 Pershing heavy tanks, 185 M45 heavy tanks, 250 T-23 experimental tanks. Total, 22,207 tanks in 4 years and 5 months. That represented about 25% of all American tank production during the war. One plant, one facility, one team of workers and engineers who proved that American industrial might was, ultimately, America's greatest weapon. On August 10, 1942, just over a year into production, the Detroit Tank Arsenal received the Army-Navy E for Excellence Award. It was the first of 4 such awards the plant would receive during the war. When World War II ended in September 1945, the Detroit Tank Arsenal faced an uncertain future. For 5 years, the plant had operated at wartime production levels. Workers had become expert at building tanks. The machinery was fine-tuned and humming. The supply chains were efficient. The nation needed hundreds of thousands of tanks. Then, suddenly, it didn't. President Truman immediately began demobilizing the military. Production orders were canceled. Tank divisions were reduced to skeleton crews. America wanted peace, wanted to convert its war machinery back to civilian production. The Detroit Tank Arsenal was closed. The workers were laid off. Some went back to their old jobs. Some found work elsewhere. The machinery sat silent. The vast, empty plant that had been the heartbeat of wartime production became a monument to a war that was over. For the federal government and Chrysler, the plant represented a massive investment that now sat idle. What would be its future? The answer came faster than anyone expected. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. Within weeks, America was at war again. Not a declared war, but a full-scale conflict that would require military production on a scale that hadn't been needed since the surrender of Germany and Japan. The Army needed tanks, a lot of them. President Truman, facing what the military called a crisis, authorized the reactivation of tank production. The Detroit Tank Arsenal would reopen. But there was a complication. The M3 and M4 tanks that had been so effective in World War II were becoming obsolete. Tank technology had advanced. The Soviets had new designs. America needed new tanks for a new kind of war. The answer came in the form of the M47 Patton tank. The M47 was named after General George S. Patton, Jr., who had died in a car accident in December 1945. It was a tribute to the man who'd done more than anyone to prove that American tanks, mass-produced and deployed in overwhelming numbers, could defeat any enemy on Earth. The M47 was fundamentally different from the Sherman. It was bigger, more heavily armored, carried a more powerful 90mm gun. It represented the evolution of tank design that had occurred in the 5 years since the last M4 Sherman rolled off the line. In May 1952, Chrysler resumed control of the Detroit Tank Arsenal from the Army, which had been unable to ramp up M47 production quickly enough. By that point, the Korean War had already begun, and the Army was desperate for tanks. Chrysler modified the plant to begin M47 production. The assembly line had to be reconfigured. New tooling was required. New training had to be conducted for workers who had either been laid off or were new to the plant. Between 1952 and 1954, Chrysler built 3,443 M47 Patton tanks at the Detroit Arsenal. But by the time these tanks were rolling off the production line, the Korean War had already reached a stalemate. An armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. The M47s arrived too late to see significant action in Korea. Most of the enemy armor had already been destroyed by M26 Pershing and M4 Sherman tanks that had entered the fight earlier. But the M47s didn't go unused. America was locked in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Tensions were high. NATO needed tanks to defend Europe against the threat of Soviet invasion. Nearly 99.7% of all M47 patents produced, including thousands built by American Locomotive Company as well as Chrysler, were exported to NATO allies. They formed the backbone of tank forces in West Germany, France, Italy, and other European nations for nearly 15 years. The Detroit tank arsenal had gone from supplying tanks to fight a hot war against Germany and Japan to supplying tanks to deter a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The mission had changed, but the importance hadn't diminished. In the late 1950s, the Detroit tank arsenal faced new challenges. Tank design was evolving rapidly. The Soviets had developed the T-54 and T-55 tanks, which were spreading throughout their satellite nations and to allied communist countries. America needed tanks that could outperform these Soviet machines. The answer was the M60 main battle tank. The M60 represented a new generation of tank design. It combined the lessons learned from World War II and Korea with new understanding of armor protection, firepower, and mobility. With its 105mm gun, advanced fire control systems, and superior armor design, the M60 was considered one of the finest tanks of its era. Beginning in the late 1950s, the Detroit tank arsenal began producing M60 tanks. From a low rate of initial production, the manufacturing process ramped up through the 1960s. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the plant was at full production, preparing M60 tanks for deployment should a conflict with the Soviet Union escalate. The M60 was never deployed in Vietnam. The terrain was too difficult for heavy tanks, and the war was fought primarily by infantry and air power. But the M60 was deployed extensively to Western Europe, where it became NATO's workhorse tank throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Production of the M60 continued at the Detroit tank arsenal through much of the 1970s and 1980s. By the time production ended in September 1987, thousands of M60 tanks had rolled off the line, first at Detroit and later at other facilities as production was distributed across multiple plants. Workers at the Detroit arsenal during this era had developed almost tribal pride in their work. They were building tanks for American soldiers. They were defending democracy. The plant, which had started as a wartime emergency measure, had become a permanent institution, a place where generations of workers built their careers. Families worked at the plant. A man might work there for 40 years, from his 20s to his 60s. His son might follow him into the factory. Grandchildren might work at the plant. The skills passed from generation to generation, refined and perfected. It was one of the great factories of the American industrial age. By the late 1970s, everyone knew that the next generation of American tanks was coming. The Soviet T-72 was a formidable machine. NATO needed to respond with something better, something that could confidently engage Soviet tanks and win. In 1976, the Defense Department selected Chrysler's design for what would become the M1 Abrams tank, named after General Creighton Abe Abrams, the famous tank commander and former commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. The M1 Abrams represented a revolutionary advance in tank technology. It was the first Western tank to use a gas turbine engine, a technology that offered unprecedented power and responsiveness. It featured Chobham armor, a revolutionary composite armor that provided superior protection against kinetic and shaped charge weapons. It had advanced fire control systems that allowed accurate shooting on the move. The Chrysler Defense Division, which was operating the Detroit tank arsenal, won the production contract for the M1 Abrams, 11 pre-production models were manufactured at the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant between February and July 1978. Low-rate initial production began in May 1979. In February 1980, the first production M1 Abrams rolled out of the Lima Army Tank Plant in Ohio. The first tanks built at Detroit Arsenal would follow. But the transition wasn't smooth. The early M1s had problems. The turbine engines had been hastily developed. Mud and dirt accumulated under the hull in field testing, causing track failures. The fire control systems had bugs. The armor packages had issues. It took months of development and refinement to get the M1 into reliable service. But when it was ready, when those problems had been solved and the tank was fully operational, the M1 Abrams was widely recognized as the world's finest battle tank. In March 1982, Chrysler Corporation sold its defense division to General Dynamics Land Systems. Chrysler had faced enormous financial challenges in the early 1980s. The company needed to shed operations and raise cash. Chrysler Defense, while profitable and strategically important, was sold to keep the automobile division alive. General Dynamics took over operation of the Detroit Tank Arsenal. The company continued production of M1 and M1A1 Abrams tanks through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Production volumes increased in the 1980s, then declined as the Cold War wound down and America faced new strategic priorities. The M1A1 represented an improved version of the original M1, with a new 120mm smoothbore gun, improved armor, and additional refinements. Production of both M1 and M1A1 tanks continued at Detroit through the early 1990s. By this point, the nature of the tank factory had changed. No longer was it primarily about mass production. The days of rolling tanks off the line at a rate of dozens per day were over. Modern tank production was more controlled, more focused on quality and advanced technology. Smaller crews, more advanced equipment, more precision. The plant had also ceased manufacturing complete tanks. Instead, it became focused on producing components, particularly for the M60, and supporting the final stages of M1 Abrams production. The end came in 1996. After 56 years of continuous tank production, the Detroit Tank Arsenal closed. The last tanks rolled off the line. The machinery was shut down. The workers were laid off or transferred to other facilities. It was the end of an era. The location that had been built in 8 months in 1940, that had produced 22,000 tanks during World War II, that had remained a bastion of American arms manufacturing through the Cold War, was now quiet. Today, the site of the Detroit Tank Arsenal is home to the U.S. Army's Tank Automotive and Armaments Command, TACOM, headquarters, an active-duty installation that employs thousands of civilians and military personnel. The original tank plant buildings have been demolished or repurposed, but the ground itself remains sacred to American military history. If you drive through Warren, Michigan, you can see the markers. A Michigan historical marker explains what happened here. Occasionally, you'll see an M60 or M48 tank on display, relics from the era of tank production. But the greatest monument to what happened here isn't a building or a monument. It's the T-34s that Soviet tankers drove, knowing they were facing M4 Shermans built by the thousands at this plant. It's the T-54 and T-55 tanks that NATO forces faced down in the Cold War, deployed against regiments equipped with M47 and M60 tanks from Detroit. It's the liberation of Europe, the containment of Soviet expansion, the defense of democracy, all made possible in part by the trucks and machines that rolled out of this single facility. If you served in the military, chances are you drove a tank built here or trained on one. If you fought in Europe, the Middle East, or anywhere American tanks were deployed, you benefited from the strategic depth that American tank production provided. The Detroit Tank Arsenal represented something uniquely American: the belief that industrial production, when properly mobilized, could accomplish the impossible. It showed that you could take people with no experience building tanks and, through training and organization and continuous improvement, turn them into skilled workers who produce the most advanced military equipment in the world. It showed that American workers, men and women, could do extraordinary things when asked, when challenged, when given the tools and the mission and the patriotic purpose. If you're old enough to remember those years, the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, the story of the Detroit Tank Arsenal isn't just history, it's memory. You might have known someone who worked there. Maybe you worked there yourself. Maybe you drove past it on 8 Mile Road and saw the massive facility, the smokestacks, the trains bringing in materials. Maybe you heard the stories at dinner, your father or uncle or neighbor talking about the shift he'd worked that day, the tanks that had come off the line, the precision required, the speed. The arsenal represented something powerful, the idea that ordinary Americans could do extraordinary things. Farmers and factory workers, and recent immigrants and second-generation Americans all worked side by side, building the machines that would win the Second World War and defend democracy for the next 50 years. The skill that those workers developed, the knowledge that American industrial processes could be applied to almost anything, the understanding that mass production didn't have to sacrifice quality, that innovation and speed could work together, became a cornerstone of American military strength throughout the post-war era. And it all started with a conversation between two men, K.T. Keller and William Knudsen, who believed that the impossible could be done. The Detroit Tank Arsenal is gone now. The smokestacks have been torn down. The assembly lines are silent. A new generation of Americans has no memory of what happened there, what was built there, what was accomplished. But the tanks that were built there, the M4 Shermans, the M47 Pattons, the M60s, even the early M1 Abrams, those machines have become part of history. They've become part of the story of how America defended itself, how it helped win a global war, how it stood watch against Soviet expansion for nearly 50 years. And somewhere, in a museum or a military base or a foreign country's tank force, some of those machines still exist. They're relics now from a different era, but they're monuments to what Americans could build when we believed we had to. That's the story of the Detroit Tank Arsenal. That's how Chrysler armed America. That's how one facility, built in 8 months on a Michigan farm, changed the course of history. And that's a story worth remembering.